thank you very much for joining. This is the Round 5 application webinar for the Heat Network Efficiency Scheme. I'm Christina, I work at GemServe, and we are the delivery partner to the Department for Energy Security Net Zero for the scheme. I'll just flick over to the just general housekeeping. So please do keep your microphones muted to improve the video quality. If you're not speaking, please turn off your webcams to improve the quality, and please do use the chat function or the Q&A function to ask any questions as we go. We'll be monitoring both of those throughout. And just to keep you aware that the seminar will be recorded and we will distribute the slides afterwards. Looking at the agenda, we're joined by Louise and Sam. Louise will be giving an introduction to HNES, and then Sam will be going through the application process before handing back over to Louise, who'll talk about how the applications are assessed. And then it'll be back over to me, and I'll talk about the support available for applicants, and then we'll make sure we answer any questions you have. So Louise, I'll swiftly hand over to you.
Fab. Thank you very much, Christina. Hi everyone, so I'm Louise Singleton. I'm the Programme Manager for HNES at GemServe. If you go to the next slide. So GemServe is the responsible for the overall scheme delivery of the Heat Network Efficiency Scheme. I should probably explain what that is first before saying HNES consistently. And we're part of a consortium with a number of other companies. So we're working with Bramble. So you may be aware that there was a demonstrator project that was run in sort of 2021-22. So we worked with Bramble on delivering that as well. And Bramble are our technical partners. They're responsible for assessing the applications that we receive and determining whether or not they are making a recommendation to the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero as to whether we think the project should be funded. So we have GemServe and Bramble, and then we've also for the main scheme we've brought in Turner and Townsend. So they are providing our pre-application support and our relationship manager service, and then we have LuxNova, who are providing legal advice if we need it for any of the grant funding agreements or things like that. So in terms of the aims and objectives of HNES, there are three. The first one is about reducing carbon emissions to make heat networks more efficient. So HNES is focusing on existing heat networks, and it's looking at improving how they operate and making them more efficient. So obviously by reducing the amount of waste heat that we are losing through the heat network, we're reducing the carbon emissions related to that. So that's the first thing that we're looking to achieve. The second objective is to reduce customer detriment to improve consumer confidence. So this has grown in prominence since the demonstrator. Obviously in the last year or so, there's been a lot of talk about the energy crisis and the cost of living crisis. So we're really keen to support heat networks to reduce the amount of energy that they need to use, and hopefully that will translate into reductions in customer bills. So that's one thing that we're really keen to support, particularly looking at customers in need. So we'll share a link in the chat to our guidance document, but yeah, there's a full document that's available on our website and the government website, which talks about how to apply for the scheme and everything about it. But there's also in there a definition of customers in need, and those are kind of the people that we're keen to support. I should say, if you don't have any customers, so for example, if you're a university or a hospital or and you have non-domestic connections, then that doesn't prohibit you from applying. It's just that this is one of our objectives for the scheme. And the third one is to help prepare the heat network market for sector regulation and technical standards. So the Energy Bill is now the Energy Act, and within that, I think that was last week, they've appointed Ofgem as the industry regulator, and they've set out some conditions around standards that are going to be coming forward that all heat networks will need to meet. And so HNES is here to support particularly those really poorly performing heat networks that need quite a lot of work to help them to improve their performance ahead of these technical standards coming in. I guess the other thing to say on the consumer confidence point is obviously we have our 2050 targets, and the Climate Change Committee has said that they need to have about 20% of our heat needs to come from heat networks by 2050 if we're to meet our net zero targets. So we want to make sure that people that have heat networks have a good experience of them, and that they are then promoting positive stories and experiences to other people that will have heat networks in the future. So that's essentially why HNES exists. We have two types of funding. We have capital funding and revenue funding. I'll start with the revenue one, even though it's the other way around. But so revenue grants are essentially for heat network operators who know that their heat network isn't performing as it should, but they don't necessarily know why. And it's to pay for a third party to come in, have a look at the network, understand how it's currently performing, why it might not, and identify why it might not be performing as it should do, and make recommendations as to what could be done to improve its performance. So these studies are fully funded. So the organisations themselves don't need to put up any match funding, and there's a budget range of about £15,000 to £24,000. So that's for those. We've got up to £2 million across this financial year and next financial year. And then following on from that is the capital grants. So you don't have to have done a HNES funded revenue study to apply for the capital grants. You can go straight into a capital grant application, but we would like to see some evidence or some kind of sort of study into why the recommendations or the measures that you're looking to implement under your capital grants are the correct measures for your heat network and the improvements that they're going to make. But essentially the capital grants are up to but not including 50% of the cost of installing a range of eligible measures, which again I'll talk through in a little bit, and they're also included in our guidance document. So for that fund, we've got 30 million across both financial years. You can apply for funding across both financial years if you want to, but you must spend all the funding that you have allocated in a particular financial year in that financial year. So you can't move if you don't spend it by the end of March 2024, you can't roll it over into the next financial year because they're allocated into those particular years. For the capital grants, obviously it's only part funded, so the heat network operators have to provide match funding to cover the rest of the project. That doesn't have to be spent at the same time as the grant funding, so you could do all of your grant funding in FY 23-24 and your match funding in FY 24-25, as long as at the end of the project the heat network operator has spent more than the grant, essentially. So they have to, the grant always has to be less than 50% of the overall cost of the project. It's also worth saying that in March the government issued I don't remember what it's called now, Powering Up Britain, I think it was called. They issued a policy paper, so there's a link to it on this slide, which basically saying that they are going to be providing capital support for heat networks out to 2028, and that includes an additional £220 million for the heat network transformation programme. So that's the wider sort of programme that the government has to support heat networks. It also includes things like the Green Heat Network Fund. And so there will be additional money within that programme for 25-26 and 26-27. We're not entirely sure at this stage what that means for HNES in terms of what additional funding may be available, but we expect to make further announcements, or expect the government to make further announcements on that in due course. But yeah, we're hoping that some of that money will make its way through to HNES. So in terms of who's eligible, So the applicant must be an operator of an existing district heating or communal heating system. And so what we don't want is is a consult, for example, in a revenue study, we wouldn't want the consultant applying, the person who's going to be undertaking the study. It would need to be the client, in that sense, the actual owner and operator of the heat network themselves, and then they would pay the consultant. In terms of sectors, so anyone public, private, third sector, hospitals, universities, housing associations, it's open to all. The heat network must be situated in England or Wales. So that's a little bit different to GHNF, which is only for England. So yeah, we do cover Wales as well. And yeah, essentially the applicant must be a legal entity and have the authority to sign off investment decisions for the heat network that they are responsible for. Particularly, I mean, that covers both capital and revenue, but it's particularly relevant for capital projects because obviously they're having to stump up their match funding portion of the grant as well. So we need to be sure that that is secured and available to allow the project to be delivered. In terms of funding rounds, so we have completed our first 4 funding rounds. So we're now looking at round 5, and the closing date for that is next Friday, the 10th of November. Sam will talk about this in a little bit more detail later, but in order to apply, you need to request a SharePoint space. So we'd need you to do that by this Friday. So you can do that by emailing us, but like I say, Sam will talk through that in a little bit. And then there's actually a little bit of a gap between the funding rounds. So the next funding round isn't until the 2nd of February. That's mainly just because of Christmas and trying to avoid that period where people are away and stuff like that. So so there is a bit of a gap. Yeah, so the next one is in February, and then we've got one in March and one in May. Okay, so eligibility criteria. So again, like I say, this is all detailed more in the guidance document. So I really would encourage you to read that if you are thinking of applying. So we cover 4 parts of the network. So first one is the energy centre or the plant room. The second one is the primary or secondary distribution network. The third one is the tertiary network. And then the fourth one is metering. It's probably easier to say what isn't eligible than what is. So I've just got a few things listed down here. So if you've already undertaken any work prior to an HNES award being made, that wouldn't be covered as part of the grant because that work has already been undertaken. Anything that's not related to the heat network infrastructure, so anything to improve building fabric, for example, it has to be to do with the heat network and not the wider building. Anything relating to engagement activities, so things like stakeholder management, would be covered. And then more specifically looking at the energy centre, so we are not covering the replacement of the primary heat generation source, partly because we don't want to be replacing things like gas boilers with gas boilers. The whole point of this is to help improve and reduce carbon emissions. So we don't want to be locking in new gas boilers for the next sort of 15, 20 years. And then if you're looking for carbon, sort of moving to a lower carbon source, there's potential to do that through the Green Heat Network Fund. So that's why it's not covered in HNES. For the tertiary systems, so that's predominantly around things like controls, so smart TRVs, for example. It wouldn't cover the cost of replacing heat emitters, such as radiators within the buildings, or the pipes that would connect to the radiators. And finally, under the metering part, anything that is anything that's required under the heat network metering and billing regulations, that wouldn't, so anything that's a legal requirement for metering, that wouldn't be covered by the grant. So anything that you have to do yourselves anyway, we wouldn't be funding. If you have done an assessment under the metering and billing regulations, and it's been deemed that it's not economically feasible for you to put the meters in, but you still want to, then potentially that could be funded under HNES. Or like I say, anything around kind of going above and beyond the requirements of the metering and billing regulations could potentially be funded as well. But yeah, anything you have a legal requirement to do wouldn't be covered. I've seen someone's asked in the chat about examples of what has been funded. I'll cover that a little bit later in one of the other slides about what we funded in round one. So in terms of revenue grants, we are funding optimization studies. So within our guidance document, there is a outline specification provided in Annex A. There's a link to it at the end as well. HNES have issued a optimization guidance document, and that covers kind of the basics of what we would expect to see in an optimization study. But similarly, anything that's ineligible is anything that's already been commissioned or occurred. Internal staffing, so project management of your consultant, for example, that wouldn't be covered. And finally, anything to do with construction, operation, and maintenance of the heat network. The optimization study is purely a report to tell you what could be implemented. If you then wanted to apply for funding to implement them, then that would be through a capital grant. Okay, so just to give you a bit more detail on what's included in an optimization study. So they're split into two work packages. The first work package is essentially the consultants coming on site. So we would require an on-site visit, capturing the data that you maybe already have, or if you don't have data, then looking at what you do have, or potentially installing some temporary metering to enable them to gather some data. And the idea is to understand how the network is currently operating, and identify the areas of suboptimal performance, and how they are impacting on the network. So we want to understand, like say, exactly how your heat network is operating now, so that when we then go on to doing the next work package on the next slide, we can then see the improvements that those measures would have based on your current performance. So the next slide is then looking at, so we've then got the actual optimization opportunities. So this is the second step of actually identifying what measures would be beneficial for the heat network, what are the costs of implementing them, what are the impacts and the benefits that will be realized from implementing them. So the idea is at the end of it, you will have a clear report that details the different work packages that you might want to take forward if you were to implement the recommendations, and it will give you a cost benefit analysis of undertaking those measures, and the things like what it would do for your carbon emissions, what it might do for your customers' bills, for example. And there will also be a techno-economic analysis element to that as well, which you should be able to then manipulate if you wanted to. It shouldn't be a locked document. You should be able to play around and change some of the parameters that you can then. The idea being that at the end of it, you're able to pull together a business case for your organisation to implement the measures that are being recommended. If you go to the next slide, so yeah, so at the end, you'll get a project report, you'll get a summary of the site visit, you'll get your techno-economic analysis spreadsheet, and I'll touch on this a bit later, but as part of your funding sort of conditions, you have to provide monitoring and reporting templates to us on a monthly basis. And within that, there is a worksheet that the consultant would need to complete once you've finished your project. And that just kind of gives an overview of the work package that have been recommended and the kinds of savings that you would be looking to achieve. And then optionally, if you did want to, you could then also submit a completed capital grant application form into our next funding round to then apply for capital funding to support you to implement the measures that have been identified. So that's what we would expect projects to get from a revenue study. Just a couple of examples then, sorry, on the next slide. So these are a couple of demonstrator projects that we had. So the first one is Hackney Council. They actually undertook 2 optimization studies on different networks. And through that, they identified 18 efficiency measures, which could save them up to £3,000 and also reduce their carbon emissions by 676 tonnes over a 20-year period. So they have since been successful in our round 1 funding round for capital funding to implement the works that were identified in the demonstrator. On the right-hand side, we've got a case study from Notting Hill Genesis. So they received just over £300,000 for capital funding, and that was to improve. They had high flow rates and return temperatures and very hot water. So their HIUs were performing really badly, and they had poor water quality. So the funding helped to reduce their flow temperatures and their return temperatures, and that led to a reduction in 32% of their gas consumption. So they had lower bills for their residents and lower carbon emissions. So these are the kind of things that we're looking to fund. If you go to the next slide. So you may have seen that we recently announced the projects that were funded for round 1. So there's a link to our press release there, and that gives a bit of detail of each of particularly the capital projects that were funded. But examples of things that were funded. So we had projects that were upgrading existing pipework. We had improving insulation. So either replacing existing insulation that may have worn down, or in some cases where pipes just were so old that they hadn't ever had insulation. So maybe installing insulation in the first place. Things like updating controls, so BMS systems, making it. I think it said on the Mildmay example that they maybe it wasn't them actually, but some projects just had the heat on all the time. So actually putting in controls to allow a bit more flexibility in terms of turning the heating down or turning it off when it's not needed. So helping again to reduce waste heat. In terms of HIUs, so replacing those was some of the projects that we received. Improving water quality and reducing leaks. So it's all the kind of typical things, I guess, that if they are heat networks are poorly performing, that projects would look to be upgrading. So they're just some of the examples. But like I say, if you want to read a bit more detail about some of the projects that we funded, that's in our press release. And we're hopefully going to be announcing the funding awards for round 2 in November, I think is the plan. So there'll be some more projects to look out for then as well. I think that's me. So I'm just going to see, there were a couple of questions. So hopefully, Nick, that's given you some examples of what was funded. Can you give some more detail on the eligibility of metering provision for revenue grant funding? So essentially for the revenue side, there is provision to install temporary metering if you don't have anything at all, and it's going to be really difficult for a consultant to understand how the network is operating without having some kind of data. It is possible to include within that budget that I said, £15,000 to £24,000, provision for temporary metering to be installed to allow that baseline to be determined. And then there's a question from Philip which says, would only apply to insulating pipes, valves, etc. I'm not entirely sure but yes, we would be able to, I guess, improving insulation was to do with pipes and valves and things like that. So so insulating the heat network essentially. So it wouldn't be insulating the building or anything like that. It's nothing to do with building fabric. It's just to do with improving the insulation of things like you say, the pipes. For CapEx funding is project.
Oh,
sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to say, do you want me to read out the questions or address them at the very end? It's up to you.
I don't mind. I think that's the last question that I can see for now. So I'll take this one and then we'll move on, I think.
Okay.
So for CapEx funding, is project management covered by the 49% match or is it 100% covered? So in terms of, when you say external project management, so if that was from the people installing the project, the measures, then basically everything is the total cost has to be under 50%. So the total grant has to be under 50%. So if you did 49% of everything and then 100% of the project management, that would take you over the 50%. So essentially it has to be under 50%, the whole thing. So yeah. Okay, let's move on now to the next step, and then we can take further questions later.
Thank you. I've turned my camera on. Let's see if it works. So I'm Sam Hales. I am the applicant support and relationship manager lead for GemServe. So just going to run through the application process a bit. So the application forms, there's two different forms. They are on Excel workbooks. And you're able to, when you go through them, see the completion status in the application status tab. There's a tab which shows you that, and it just something to highlight. And in the current versions of the application forms are version 5 for capital and version 3 for revenue. And again, you can see that in the file title that we send you, or the cover page of the application form. So they are broken down into 6 tabs. So we've got A, B, C here, and we've got the other tabs on the other slide. So I'll quickly run through them. So in tab A, this is the applicant info. So all the information that about yourself as the applicant. So as Louise said, you need to be the owner or operator of the heat network. And in this tab here, we need you to put stuff like your organisation name. It needs to match the legal entity exactly of your organisation. So for instance, companies on Companies House or charities on the Charity Commission website. So it needs to match exactly as it is legally. And then we also need you to ensure that you put in VAT numbers, things, all the bits that are asked for in that tab. It's really important that we can get all that information so that we're able to assess your application, and it prevents us coming back for more questions later on. So tab B is about your project information. So it's a description of the heat network. It asks for the address. It asks about some of the characteristics, the amount of dwellings that are there, and any other sort of regulatory parts, including like heat trust regulations, and asking about the heat network metering and billing regulations. So again, this is your bit just to put in about your actual project that you are applying for. And then tab C is the project narrative. So this is a bit more free text. You're able to put in a bit more information, and it's your chance to tell us about your project in tab C. So basically, please be as detailed as you can, and cover all the information that is asked for in that tab. The more information we have, the more we can assess on. We can only assess on what you put in your application form. So the more you can put in, the more obvious you can make it, the easier it is to assess your application, and for the assessors to score it well for you. So as it says here, it's sort of the overview of the project and the funding request. It's got bits around the network data availability, quality and metering, the rationale for the application for HNES in relation to the objectives. These are objectives that Louise ran through earlier at the start. So they're reducing the carbon emissions, and also reducing customer detriment. An approach to the dissemination of information, so across your organisation and maybe other organisations and local places, and then a bit about suboptimal outcome experiences. So as we said, it's best to try and put in as much detail as you can, Ned. It makes it easier to assess your application against the scoring. And as I can see, Louise has just put in the chat, there is a character limit, but it's quite a high character limit. So moving on to the other 3 tabs, we have tab D, which is around baseline and targets. So again, if you can enter as much information as possible in these tabs, it really helps the assessment. We are aware, obviously, that some projects may not have all this information, and that is fine, but the more you put in, the better it is for the assessment. So if you've got it, please do put it in. And if it is a metric that you are trying to improve, we need that baseline and your target that you'd like to reach. So we do need both. We can't just have the baseline, or we can't just have the target. We need both, because we need to be able to say, you know, how much you're improving by. And then these figures, if you didn't have them exactly, they can be calculated, but again, we need that detail around how they're being calculated so that assessors are able to ensure that they are accurate figures. So as it says there, there's bits around the imported fuel, the energy generation, you know, the heat demands and losses, and as you can see, it goes on and on there. So the more you can put in there, the better it is, again, for the assessment. And then moving on to tab E. So this is the funding and procurement tab. So this is quite an important one. It's where you let us know how much money you are asking for and how much your project will cost. So as Louise said earlier, it's up to, but not including, 50% for capital applications, and it can be up to 100% for revenue. So it is ensuring that you have put those in and that you're showing us you're showing us how much your total cost is, how much you're applying for, and anything around financial years. So as it says there, it's broken down in the capital form into different network areas being applied for, and it asks for a bit of a description so that we're able to see exactly what you're asking for in that part. And again, there's a bit about procurement, description, and milestones that we're able to work all of those out to see where your project is delivering. The final tab is confirmations. And this is around the supporting evidence that we'll move on to next, saying that you've got all of that and it's attached to the application, and as well as declarations from yourself as the applicant. So if we move on to the supporting evidence, it is, as you can see, largely the same, but the capital builds off the revenue one. So what I'll do is I'll start by reading through the revenue, or talking through the revenue grant, supporting evidence, and then I can later on move back to capital to build off that. So in terms of revenue grant supporting evidence, we need evidence of the application costs. So this could be quotes from the consultant. That's the best sort of application cost. So we need to see that sort of side of things, that we're able to so you can justify what you're asking for. And then signed letters confirming the applicant's support for the application and works to be supported. Any match funding if relevant. So if you have a particularly expensive project or something like that, or you choose you'd like to match fund some of it, we need the confirmation that you can match fund it, and then as well as acceptance of the monitoring and reporting requirements, and confirmations of all the other confirmations that we need to make sure you've got the sign off to do the application. And then also an outline project program to justify, again, those sort of project milestones that you've put in your application form. So they're what we need. Obviously, if you've got more supporting evidence to support some of the figures that you've maybe put in the application form or anything like that, you're more than welcome to submit it as well. But they are what we need in supporting evidence for the revenue grant. For capital, as I said, it's largely the same, but there's a bit more that's needed because it's capital one, where a bit more, slightly you're applying for a bit more funding. So again, we need those evidence of costs. So again, those sort of things like quotes, and we need evidence of targeted benefits. So that is the tab which will ask for your target, also your baseline figures at the moment and your target. So we need those sort of justifications there, or evidence of those, that we can see that they are ones that you're going to be able to hit and they are accurate at the moment. We need signed letters confirming, and again, largely similar to the revenue grant, that you've got support for the application and the works, the match funding has been secured, that you're accepting the monitoring reporting requirements, and confirmation of any other relevant subsidiaries to the project. A summary of the programme of works. Again, we need to be able to see that it is deliverable on the timeframes that you've said it's going to be delivered in. And where applicable, this sort of confirmation of the eligibility for metering costs relative to heat network meter and billing regulation requirements. So in terms of organisations, some might have multiple projects they're wishing to apply for. So in particular, this is around your sort of revenue ones, that we do not intend to fund sort of multiple applications by a single applicant where they're considered similar in terms of the engineering, design or operation. So again, this is around that dissemination of information that we spoke about earlier, that we want you to be able to maximise the funding, carry out an optimization study on one heat network and apply the learnings across more than one heat network. So that's what that sort of is related to. And as it says in sort of that second point, it's applicants should consider the extent to which learnings from a smaller number of optimization studies may support, validate or enable similar works in other projects. It's worth saying that obviously not all heat networks are the same, so you can apply for more than one if they are different sorts of heat networks, things like that. So moving on to sort of submitting an application. As Louise was saying, we need you to submit via SharePoint. So the deadline is Friday the 3rd of November. We create SharePoint spaces. They're empty SharePoint spaces for you with folders in for you to drop your application form into and your supporting evidence. We will create them, we will send you a link, and then you can log in, and you can, once they're completed, you can put your documents in for us. As we have sort of said earlier, or we've sent out mailing lists and or emails to the mailing list, things like that, is the application forms have been updated since round 4. So if you've been working on an application form for a little while, if you can double check you've got the right versions. It is currently version 5 for the capital form and version 3 for the revenue form. So they're the ones that you need to submit on. If you submit on an older one, we will just come straight back to you and ask you to transfer it across to a newer form. So please do make sure you're using the right form. If you don't have it, the most up-to-date form, please email us on that email address, which is hnes@gemserve.com, and you can request the latest application form and we will send them over to you. If you are interested in applying to either round 5 or future rounds after round 5, please again email us, express the interest in applying. We will ask a couple of questions around your project, and that means we can log it and expect, we can make sure that we have a suitable sort of pipeline. The funding, we can look at funding drawdowns, things like that. We can also make sure we reach out to you before deadlines to see if you're still planning on applying. So as I said earlier, and I'll just highlight it again, if you can ask by Friday the 3rd of November for a SharePoint space, we will set it up so that you can then apply. And the closing date for the round is the following Friday, so Friday the 10th of November. I will hand back to Louise unless there are other questions. I can see that Louise has been busy answering most of them as I've been talking, I believe.
I think there are a couple more, but we can probably address them at the end, unless anyone has a chance to answer them as Louise continues with the assessment process.
I'm in the process of writing an answer to one of them, so I'll just press enter on that one, but I can probably talk a bit more to it. So it was talking about subsequent projects, about giving evidence that a heat network or measure being explored is sufficiently different and will not benefit from previously awarded funding. So so that's particularly relevant for revenue projects. We want to make sure that if you are applying for multiple revenue studies, that they are sufficiently different from each other The pot for revenue is not massive, and we want to make sure that as many people can benefit from the pot as possible. So yeah, so one of the if you are submitting or if you are requesting multiple projects, particularly on the revenue side, it would be useful to outline why you think you need to have the different projects and why they are sufficiently different. For capital, it's less of a requirement, because even if you're replacing even if you're doing similar measures in a heat network, you still need the money to make to implement the measures, and it's not so easy to share learning. So you might be able to say that actually you've learned some things in terms of how you would go about completing the project from a previous capital project that you've done. So there might be efficiencies there, but in terms of particularly if you're replacing kits, like you still need to buy the kit. So it would be useful to demonstrate any learnings you have learned from previous projects, but it wouldn't necessarily preclude you from applying on the capital side if it was a similar project. But like I say, on a revenue side, it might do if they're deemed to be too similar. Okay, so I'll carry on, and then if there are further questions, we can answer them at the end, just conscious of time. So in terms of the scoring criteria, so for capital applications, there are 5 areas that we look at. The first one is deliverability, and that's split into 2 parts. One is around cost certainty and one is around delivery certainty. So obviously you have to put in an amount of grant that you're looking for, and you have to explain how much you think your project's going to cost. We want to understand how likely is that cost to be correct, and because basically the funding that you are awarded, particularly if your project ends up being more expensive than you originally thought, the funding is what the funding is. It's not necessarily, it wouldn't be able to be increased if your project turned out to be more expensive. So that's where it kind of comes down to the evidence around things like quotes. So one of the questions that I've answered in the chat was around, do we have to provide 3 quotes? Not necessarily, particularly if you've already got a chosen contractor that you're working with. But obviously the more quotes you have, the more confident we can be that the quote or the amount that's being provided is fair and reasonable and reflective of what might play out when the work is undertaken. So that's kind of what we're looking for on cost certainty. And then delivery certainty is essentially around your project plan. So we'd like to see a project plan, ideally as detailed as possible. Partly that's to make sure that if you're applying for funding in different financial years, that the project can be, or the elements of the project can be completed in the particular financial year, so that the grant funding can be drawn down in the financial year it's allocated to. But also we want to make sure that the plan is reasonable and is likely to be able to be implemented. So that's the deliverability side. In terms of network performance improvements, so we want to understand what benefits are you expecting to achieve from implementing your measures. So this, in the application form, as Sam's mentioned, we have a baseline column and a target column. So we want to understand how is your project operating now, and where do you think you'll be able to get to as a result of implementing the measures. So we're looking at things like the cost of delivering heat to the operator, to the end customer, how much has the network efficiency improved, or how much are you reducing your heat losses. If you have unplanned interruptions, particularly if there's a lot of them, will these measures reduce those? Will there be savings in your gas and electricity usage? And we're also looking at the quality of supporting information. So where you have put target figures in, we want to understand how did you arrive at those figures? What's the calculations that you've done, or the evidence that you've used? So for example, if you have an optimization study done, that's something that your consultant should have provided that evidence. So that would be a really strong element to provide as supporting evidence for your capital application. Like I say, you don't have to have done an HNES funded optimization study. You don't even necessarily have to have done an optimization study, but that evidence does just give us more confidence in those figures that you're providing. So the final 3 elements on capital applications. We go to the next slide. There we go. So we have project narrative. So we've talked a bit about these in the chat as well. Each question is limited to 10,000 characters. And we want to understand how your project aligns with our objectives. So particularly around carbon reductions and addressing customer detriment. So that's objectives 1 and 2. And then what's your approach to disseminating information? So we want to make sure that we're not funding projects and then this money just goes into an organization and none of that learning or is shared. So that could be within your own organization. If you have a portfolio of heat networks, you can take that learning and apply it to other networks, or even more broadly out to the market to help improve the heat network industry and the networks that we have, but also just in terms of communicating with your customers as well. So keeping your customers up to date, explaining to them the benefits of the work that's being undertaken, so that they can understand any disruption that they're receiving and the benefits that they're going to achieve from the end of it. So that's your opportunity to write a lot of text and let us know why is your project a good project and why does it align with our objectives. In terms of value for money, so we're looking at the costs, obviously, that you've put forward, but also what does that relate to in terms of carbon savings, gas savings, electricity savings. So that's very much more quantitative and looking at the kind of how per pound how much carbon are we saving or gas savings are we making, sort of thing. And finally, the data availability and baselining. So we do look at how much data is available and therefore how I guess how do you know how well your heat network is operating? But again, we're not necessarily penalising projects that don't have that data, but it's just something we're interested to understand, and we want to know things like, do you have energy meters? How frequently do they provide you with data? How many meters do you have? What do they meter? That kind of thing. For the revenue applications, so we just have the 3 categories. So again, it's the project narrative, the deliverability, and the data availability and baselining. So again, even more so on the revenue applications, the whole point of the revenue studies is to give all heat networks who don't necessarily have data or an understanding of how their networks are operating the tools, I guess, and the knowledge to improve their networks. So while it is a factor in the applications, it's not a limiting factor in that sense. So just something to be aware of. Okay, next slide. So in terms of the round 5 timescales, so like as we said, the deadline is the 10th of November. The first 6 weeks after that will be the assessment period. So that's the Ramboll technical assessors reviewing your applications, and that will include a clarification period. So there will be opportunities for the assessors to ask questions back to the projects if there's anything that's not clear in the application. We typically have 2 to 3 rounds of clarifications during that period. So it's really, really important that if a clarification is issued to you, and it will be issued into your SharePoint space where you've uploaded your application form, that you reply to the clarification and you provide as much evidence as you can. If you don't reply, it won't necessarily mean that your application won't be assessed. It just means that we'll only be able to assess on what we have. And if it's not clear, then the applicants, the assessors can't score it as well as they might do if you've replied to your clarification questions. So please reply to those in a timely manner. I've put some indicative dates for this round. Please note these are just indicative. There is subject to slippage or subject to change as things go through. But yeah, we've got a 2-week break for Christmas built into this time, this round. We then make a recommendation to the investment committee, and they will then undertake an assessment of the recommendations and make a decision on whether they think the project should be awarded funding or not. The projects then have to go through an internal awards approvals process within the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero. And it's at that point, once that's complete, that we will confirm to all applicants if they've been successful or not. So we're looking at kind of the middle of February for this round. That's relevant specifically for this round because of the funding for this financial year having to be spent by the 31st of March. So it's obviously not a massive window to know that you've been successful and then you've assigned your grant funding agreement, and then to actually install, or then to actually spend some of the money. Things that might be possible to do are things like buying kit up front. So if you were looking to replace parts or things like that, it might be possible to be able to purchase those within that month. But obviously there's a risk there that if that doesn't happen, then that funding's maybe lost. So it's just something to be aware of when you're completing your application form. There's a difference between how local authority projects are approved to non-local authority applicants. So non-local authority applicants receive a grant funding agreement, and that's hopefully around week 15. But local authority applicants have to undergo Section 31 approvals as well. So that can just take a little bit longer. And then they'll get a memorandum of understanding issued to them. So just to note that it might be a slightly longer process of getting the legal documents issued to local authority applicants. So I've talked about clarifications. Yeah, please make sure that you are around. Someone is around between weeks 1 to 6 where clarifications could be raised. And there may also be further clarifications as part of the investment committee process as well. So just something to look out for. Next slide. So I'll quickly touch on M&R. So as I said, a condition of your funding is to regularly submit monitoring and reporting returns to us. So these are essential for us to understand if your project is on track, if it's going to meet its timeframes, if it's going to align with the aims of HNES. And we will provide written guidance to successful projects on how to complete their M&R returns. But from a revenue perspective, they are required every month from when your grant award has been signed until when your optimization study has been signed off by us. And they basically cover your project progress, any risks and issues, and some information around how you're planning to draw down your budget. And then I've mentioned before, the final return includes the optimization study outputs that your consultant will complete. So that's the sort of outcomes of your study. From a capital perspective, again, once you've signed your grant funding agreement, you're required to submit them monthly until 24 months after your commissioning date. So we want to see that your project is achieving the benefits that you've identified in your application form, and we want to go through 2 heating cycles to give us that confidence that that performance is there. So once the project has been commissioned, it's another 24 months after that. So the monthly returns are the same, but for on a quarterly basis, we then have another tab that looks at your benefits that you said in your application form and how you are then performing against those in reality as your project progresses. So once your commissioning date, once your project's been commissioned, you then drop down to quarterly returns. So you then just have to provide your progress against benefits, because obviously your actual project in terms of delivery has been completed. Next tab. Okay, I'll hand over to Christina and I'll try and answer some questions in the chat if they haven't already been answered, because I'm just
Thank you, Louise. I think you've actually answered, you and some have answered most of them or all of them.
Oh, fab.
But yeah, just a bit on support available from me. So if you do have a general inquiry about HNES and want to be added to our mailing list if you're not on it already, or if you need anything signposted to you, like application forms or anything like that, please email hnes@gemserve.com and we'll help you with that. On the screen there, you can see Louise, who you've unfortunately not being able to see today. I don't know what's going on with Teams. Louise, and then there's Sam, who I think also you couldn't see. I couldn't see you either, Sam, so I don't know what is going on. And then on the right hand side, you'll see that if you have any questions about your project and would like to discuss your application in more detail, then please reach out to one of our relationship managers. And the email address for that is hnes.support@gemserve.com. So you can see the pictures of the team there. And then, yeah, there's a link on there as well for the HNES guidance for applicants. And then just to the next slide. So prospective applicants can access front-end support from our pre-application support team, as I just discussed. Or if you want to reach out before you begin your application. And then we can also provide initial contacts and issue the application form. We can set up one-to-ones with dedicated relationship managers to discuss your application. We can conduct a first pass review of applications so we can give you some feedback before you submit. And yeah, just respond to any inquiries you do have before the submission. And we can also signpost to applicants when we think that you are ready to submit as well. So essentially, we're here to support you as much as we can. And then finally, from me, it's just to let you know that we've got a dedicated HNES LinkedIn page. So do follow us. It's to just keep updated on events and information. And we've also got a HNES X or Twitter account as well. But yeah, do make sure that you join our mailing list as well, because we make sure that we keep you updated on everything related to the scheme and heat networks there. I'm just checking if there's any more questions, but I don't think there actually are. I think well done to Louise and Sam for being rapid in your responses to those.
If anyone does have any further questions or they want to speak to us ahead of the deadline, then the email address is there. So please just drop us an email and we'll hopefully get back to you as soon as we can.
Thanks, Louise. I think somebody did ask as well, but we will circulate the recording and the slides as well with all attendees.
Perfect. All right, thank you very much. And if you haven't requested a SharePoint space, please email us so that we can set it up for you ahead of 10th of November.